So let's turn to the epistle itself a little bit and talk in this session about chapters 1 to 3. Tell us about how the epistle starts and what's at stake for Paul as he introduces himself and his gospel to these Romans.
Right. As always in Paul's epistles, he begins with a salutation. And this is a standard form of letter writing. In antiquity, Paul develops it a little bit more than you'd find in private letters of which we have an abundance from papyri.
Right.
But it's basically the same form. That is, the sender says that he's sending greetings to the recipients, and he identifies who those recipients are, and then expands on that a little bit. And so Paul's expansion of that salutation tells us something about his concerns in the first couple of verses of Romans. Christ is at the center of all of this, the gospel about Christ, which he talks about in verses 3 and 4. The gospel concerning his Son, the Son of God, who was descended from David according to the flesh and was declared to be Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. So Christ's status as the Son of God manifested in his resurrection is something that's central to what Paul wants to talk about. And
is the David versus resurrection thing, is that a way of saying both for Jews and for Gentiles? Does the Son of David claim his Jewishness and the rest claim his Gentile application too?
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Certainly the allusion to David is an appeal to the Jewish tradition. And one of the things that Paul wants to insist on is that despite the discontinuities in salvation history, there's an important strand of continuity. And Christianity is rooted in its Jewish sources in a significant way. So the allusion to David, I think, is part of that, that general claim. In any case, Paul goes on, says a little bit about himself and his apostleship. So that was a major issue in some of his earlier correspondence. It's not an issue here, but it's something that he wants to appeal to as part of his relationship with this community. And then the next phase of the letter, a standard part of any ancient letter, is a little prayer of thanksgiving. And almost all of Paul's letters have a section like this, where Paul offers a bit of thanks or praise to God for something. And usually what he's thanking people for is something that he has on his mind. That's going to be part of the letter. So the thanksgiving begins in verse 8. First I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. And one of the key things that Paul is going to be arguing is that the relationship between God's people and God is now based on faith, not based on ethnic derivation or
obedience to law.
Obedience to the law. So the faith of the Romans that he is not responsible for is something that he wants to celebrate and wants to argue about a little bit later on. And so he continues then and talks about his longing to be part of the community of Rome and to have them supporting his mission, as we'll hear at the end of the letter. And he mentions all of this, mentions the way in which he's related to Gentiles as well as to Jews, whatever the composition of the Roman community might be. And then finally in verses 16 and 17, he gives us, I think, what's almost a thesis statement about the letter. And one thing about Romans is that it is structured as something of an argument. There's a connectedness to the letter that we don't have in some other of Paul's letters, where the discrete problems are taken up, for instance, in Corinthians
one by one.
So the thesis statement: for I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. Here, that theme of faith. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So the relationship between Jew and Greek, point of tension, as you indicated, possibly at work in Rome, is something that he wants to address here. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. So the prose gets to be celebratory here and a little bit opaque.
It does.
But we know that Paul is celebrating the action of God, which he sees taking place in Christ and in his own apostolate, and it's an action that works somehow through faith.
It's almost as if 17 could be the righteousness of God is revealed through God's faithfulness for the faith of believers. I think that gets the two-sidedness of it in a way.
That's right. And it's interesting to think about just a little bit what this term faith means. We're going to have to be coming back to that, especially in Romans 4. And it's inappropriate, I think, to think of it in simply cognitive terms.
Oh, I do too, absolutely.
As a form of belief. Although there are cognitive dimensions to it. It does involve fidelity. It does involve an act of the heart and of the will as well as of the
trust.
And it is, as you say, it goes both ways. God is faithful to God's promises, and people respond as Jesus responded, as the faithful one to God. That's at the heart of Paul's
I think it's both there, right.
So Paul, at the beginning of Romans 1 then, sort of sets the tone for the whole letter and sounds some themes that are going to be really important. And then what he does in the next 2 chapters is, I think in broad terms, to set out the problem that the righteousness of God was designed to solve.
Okay.
So he reflects here in a way he has not done in some of his other epistles, almost globally, sketching the human condition and the way in which God has somehow addressed that human condition. And what the heart of the argument is that sin is a reality that pervades the human condition. Whether
universally,
no
exceptions.
Whether you're a Gentile or whether you are a Jew, there is sin in your experience.
Right.
And God, through Christ, has somehow addressed that problem of sin.
Yeah.
So that's the overall structure here. I don't know about you, but do you find it sometimes hard to follow Paul's arguments?
I do. I sometimes have a hard time. He sometimes seems to be responding to somebody who we don't meet on the scene, and it's not clear that the arguments just come from his own mind. He imagines interlocutors to whom he responds, and that always puzzles me.
Right.
In this passage particularly.
Yeah, for instance, at the beginning of chapter 2, therefore you have no excuse.
Who's you, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This is something that we find in certain kinds of philosophical literature in antiquity, usually called the diatribe. And it's a form of scholastic discourse. People like Epictetus in the first century, a Greek philosopher, uses this form pretty widely. People have recognized this for a good long time and have recognized that one of the things that you have to unpack in Paul is the way in which he uses these imaginary interlocutors at times to move the argument along. So I think one of the things that we need to hear here, especially in the latter part of chapter 1, is another person's voice.
Okay.
The voice perhaps of a Gentile philosopher. It's been identified in different ways.
It is.
Gentile philosopher or a Jew preaching to Gentiles. The latter works pretty well, I think.
Does work pretty well.
And then Paul sort of speaks in the persona of that individual and then sort of turns the tables on him.
Speaks back to himself,
you could see that again in verse 17 of chapter 2. But if you call yourself a Jew, right, who's the you? The you is some sort of imaginary Jewish interlocutor who at that point has probably been condemning Gentiles.
Right.
And what Paul wants to say is, I endorse what Jews have said about the sinfulness of Gentiles, but I also want to point out to both Jew and Gentile that people who are making those condemnatory remarks are themselves sinful.
Absolutely.
In fact, are sinful in part because they're making those remarks.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of clever dialogical scheme that Paul has working here, and you have to be attentive to the different voices that Paul is using.
So where does he go in trying to solve the problem he sets up? He says everybody has sinned. Mm-hmm. Then what's the beginning of a solution anyway?
The beginning of the solution, Paul sketches at the end of chapter 3. And this has caused all sorts of theological reflection. From chapter 3, verse 21 on, Paul says, "But now, irrespective of law," and the role of law, the role of Torah is something that's going to be on Paul's mind throughout. "Irrespective of law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed, attested by the law and the prophets." He's just used scriptural quotations to show that everybody is sinful.
Right.
"The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe." Note, by the way, the phrase "faith in Jesus Christ." There's a translation issue here that goes back to what we were talking about faith and fidelity.
Yeah.
And a lot of scholars now think it's more proper to translate this and analogous phrases as the faith of Jesus Christ. The fidelity and commitment that Jesus himself exemplified is that which we imitate in becoming part of his community. And I think that's probably right. In any case, God has done something, the righteousness of God, acting through the fidelity of Christ, which has a beneficial impact on all who follow Christ in that fidelity, all who believe. And Paul emphasizes the impartiality of God and the universality of the message. There's no distinction. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, this is verse 23, but are now justified by his grace as a gift.
Yeah.
So God, the fundamental point that Paul says is that God has taken action to deal with this problem of universal sin, and it's an act of pure grace.
Yeah. Gift.
A gift.
Gift, not an achievement.
That's right.
Yeah, hugely
a gift
important.
that God has given to humankind, somehow connected with the death of Christ.
Yeah.
And that's indicated in verse 25, whom God put forward as, and here another translation problem, put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood. That may be, it's certainly one way of translating it. It may be Paul's notion that Christ was in some ways a sacrificial offering, a vicarious sufferer, evoking the servant songs of Isaiah. That may be lurking in the background. It may be that he alludes here, using cultic language, to the seat of mercy in the Holy of Holies of the temple, the locus of God's gracious act. Whatever, doesn't matter. For our purposes, the theological tradition has worried an awful lot about how that works.
What that atonement looks like.
Paul doesn't worry about how it works. He just says God has taken care of it.
Yeah.
And what we have to do is accept God's gracious gift.
Okay. Well, and then with 4 on, we begin to see what that might look like in our lives.
Right. Absolutely. Maybe before we conclude, we ought to think about some of the little difficulties that pop up in these first couple of chapters.
That's fine.
What do you do, for instance, with some of the sins that Paul...
Well, I think that you set the context right. The context is that Paul wants to implicate everyone in sin. It's fairly clear how you do that with Jews. They disobey the law. Gentiles seem not to have the law. How can you blame Gentiles? And his prime example of Gentile sin is idolatry. And that leads into the complicated material about human sexuality in chapter 1. And what I say about that is, within his context, idolatry is his great concern. Sexuality is a secondary concern. It's certainly one that's driven the discussion in our churches for the past 25 or 30 years.
Yeah, those verses are Romans 1, 26 and following.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, the fundamental problem is idolatry. And then Paul says that is the source of everything else that's wrong with humankind.
Very long grocery list, yeah.
And he mentions in here same-sex relations of various sorts, picking up on themes from Leviticus.
Exactly.
Which is not a concern to him in most of
Right. Suddenly he needs it,
Yeah. And I think one of the things we have to keep in mind here is that this section, Romans 1:18 through the end of that chapter, is really kind of boilerplate.
Yes, absolutely.
It's sort of...
He Googled sin.
Something like that. Yeah. This is what your standard Jewish preacher would be saying in talking to Gentiles about why they should give up their lifestyle and become Jews. I'm not sure Paul has given an awful lot of thought to that, and he certainly hasn't given thought to human sexuality in the way in which we have come to understand it.
I sometimes tell congregations that asking what Paul thought about homosexuality as we think about it is like asking what he thinks about evolution. And that our world of thought is, he didn't have it. He didn't think about those things the way we do.
Right. So, in any case, idolatry certainly is one of the main things that he talks about. Some other interesting features here is that he insists that people are going to be judged on the basis of what they do.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we hear of Paul's gospel of justification by faith, we forget that there's also an element of human responsibility.
Absolutely.
And we're going to hear that theme
hugely
moving
in the last part of
letter.
Romans. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Okay.